The rain had started just after 7, transforming downtown Chicago into a blur of headlights and wet pavement. David Werner sat in the back of the rideshare, watching droplets race across the window as the driver navigated through Monday evening traffic on West Randolph Street. His reflection stared back at him, a 42-year-old man who looked older than his years, with premature gray threading through his dark hair and the kind of permanent tension lines that came from too many late nights reviewing financial reports. "Terrible weather we're having," the driver commented, his accent suggesting he was originally from somewhere on the East Coast. "Been like this all week." "Yeah," David replied absently, his mind already in the restaurant, already reviewing the numbers he'd memorized. The acquisition, the presentation, Thursday morning, 9 a.m. sharp, in front of the board. Everything had to be perfect. The car pulled up to Marcello's, a high-end Italian restaurant tucked into a historic building on North Clark Street, the kind of place where business people closed deals over $30 pasta and wine that cost more than most people's car payments. David had chosen it specifically for that reason. Quiet, upscale, unlikely to be crowded on a Monday evening. He needed space to spread out his documents, to review everything one final time before the weekend. "Thanks," he said, handing the driver a $5 tip through the app before stepping out into the rain. The cold November air hit him immediately, sharp and biting. He pulled his overcoat tighter and hurried toward the entrance. His leather messenger bag clutched against his chest to protect its contents. Inside that bag were 3 months of work: financial statements, corporate structures, due diligence reports on Meridian Technologies, the mid-sized tech firm his company was preparing to acquire. The warmth of Marcello's interior was a relief. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, mixing with the gentle murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware on porcelain. The lighting was deliberately dim, casting everything in warm amber tones that made the dark wood paneling glow. Oil paintings of the Italian countryside lined the walls, and the scent of garlic, basil, and slowly simmered tomato sauce filled the air. "Good evening, sir. Table for one?" The hostess was young, probably 23 or 24, with the kind of professional smile that came from years of customer service training. "Yes, please. Somewhere quiet, if possible. I'll be working." She nodded, understanding immediately. This was Chicago's financial district. She probably seated a dozen people like him every week. "Right this way." She led him to a corner table, exactly what he needed. Positioned away from the kitchen noise but with enough light to read comfortably. The table was larger than necessary for one person, which was perfect. He'd need the space. "Your server will be right with you. Enjoy your evening." David settled into his chair, removed his coat, and began the ritual he'd performed countless times before. Messenger bag opened, laptop positioned on the left, documents arranged on the right, the most important ones on top, others stacked in order of relevance. Phone face down beside the laptop, silenced. Water glass within easy reach. He opened the primary folder, the one marked Meridian Tech, Executive Summary, and began his review. The numbers told a story if you knew how to read them. Revenue growth of 18% year over year. Profit margins healthy but not exceptional. Debt-to-equity ratio well within acceptable parameters. On paper, Meridian Technologies looked like exactly what his firm wanted. A solid mid-market company with room for growth, ready to be absorbed into a larger corporate structure. But David had learned long ago that paper rarely told the whole story. His pen moved across the margins, noting observations. The offshore accounts bothered him. Not illegal, necessarily. Plenty of tech companies maintained international subsidiaries for tax purposes, but the structure seemed unnecessarily complex. Money flowing from the main corporate account to a holding company in Delaware, then to another entity in the Cayman Islands, then back to a subsidiary in Ireland, before finally appearing as consulting fees on the balance sheet. He'd flagged it in his initial report 3 weeks ago. His boss, Richard Caldwell, had dismissed it during their meeting. "That's standard tax optimization, David. Every tech company does it. Don't bog down the presentation with technical details the board doesn't need." But it kept nagging at him. The amounts were significant, nearly $40 million over the past 18 months, all following the same circuitous route. And when he'd tried to trace the ultimate recipients of those consulting fees, he'd hit walls. Shell corporations with minimal public information, addresses that led to mailbox services, directors whose names appeared on dozens of other corporate registrations but who seemed to have no actual business operations. "Good evening. Can I start you off with something to drink?" David looked up, pulled from his thoughts. The waitress stood beside his table, order pad in hand. She was petite, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her name tag read, Maria. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from working double shifts, from juggling multiple jobs, from life being harder than it should be. Just water for now, thanks. I'll order food in a bit. She nodded, and he thought he saw her eyes flicker down to his documents before she turned away. Probably just curious. Most people were when they saw someone working through dinner at a nice restaurant. It marked you as either extremely dedicated or extremely lonely. David suspected he qualified as both. He returned to his work, making notes about questions to anticipate from the board. They'd want to know about Meridian's key personnel. Would the founding executives stay on after acquisition, or would there be a transition period? They'd ask about integration costs, about potential redundancies, about whether the combined entity would be worth more than the sum of its parts. Those questions he could answer. What he couldn't explain was the nagging feeling that something was wrong, that the numbers were too clean, too perfect, that the offshore structures weren't just tax optimization, but something else entirely. The restaurant filled up gradually around him. A couple celebrating an anniversary 2 tables over. 3 businessmen discussing a real estate deal near the window. A family with 2 teenage children who clearly didn't want to be there. The background noise was comforting in its predictability, the soundtrack of normal life continuing around him, while he dove deeper into corporate balance sheets and cash flow statements. Maria returned with his water, and he ordered without looking up from his documents the chicken piccata, salad with vinaigrette on the side, no appetizer. She wrote it down and disappeared again. Professional, efficient, forgettable, except she kept appearing in his peripheral vision. David noticed it gradually, the way you notice a sound that's been present for a while but only just registered consciously. Maria was passing by his table more frequently than seemed necessary. Not hovering exactly, she was too skilled a server for that, but present, refilling water glasses that were still 3/4 full, adjusting the placement of the salt and pepper shakers on nearby tables, wiping down surfaces that already looked clean. And each time she passed, her eyes went to his documents. He told himself he was being paranoid. The stress of the acquisition, the long hours, the pressure of the upcoming presentation, it was making him see patterns where none existed. She was just doing her job. Maybe she was new and overeager. Maybe the manager was watching her performance. Maybe she was just one of those people who couldn't stand still. His food arrived, delivered by a different server, an older man with a thick Italian accent who wished him buon appetito before moving on to the next table. David ate mechanically, fork in his left hand, pen in his right, reviewing the documents even as he chewed. The chicken was excellent, perfectly cooked, but he barely tasted it. His mind was in the spreadsheets, in the columns of numbers that didn't quite align the way they should. There, that line item. Technology licensing fees paid to another subsidiary. $12 million over 6 months, for software that Meridian had supposedly developed in-house. Why would a company pay licensing fees for its own technology, unless the subsidiary owned the intellectual property separately, which raised questions about why they'd structured it that way? More tax optimization, or something else? He was so focused on the document that he didn't see Maria approaching with the wine bottle. The restaurant had a policy, he would learn later, of offering complimentary wine tastings to solo diners who ordered entrees. A small gesture meant to make people feel welcome, to encourage them to relax and enjoy the experience, rather than treating Marcello's like a cafeteria. Maria had selected a Chianti, a 2019 vintage from a small vineyard in Tuscany that the sommelier particularly liked. She'd been planning to offer David a small pour, to smile and make the standard speech about the restaurant's hospitality, to give him a moment of human connection in what was clearly a solitary, work-focused evening. But as she approached his table, something changed in her expression. David saw it later when he replayed the moment in his mind 1,000 times. A flash of recognition, of decision, of fear and determination, mixing into something that looked almost like resolve. Her hands began to tremble. "Sir, we'd like to offer you a complimentary." The bottle slipped. Or that's what it looked like. One moment she held it firmly, the next it was tilting, and then the dark red wine was pouring out in a stream that seemed to move in slow motion, splashing directly onto his carefully arranged documents. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." David jerked backward, chair scraping against the floor. The wine spread across the table in a crimson tide, soaking into papers that represented 3 months of work. His laptop was safe. He'd grabbed it instinctively, but the documents were drowning in Chianti. "I'm so sorry, sir." Maria's voice was high with panic as she grabbed napkins from a nearby table, dabbing uselessly at the spreading stain. "I don't know what happened, It's okay," David heard himself saying, though his heart was pounding. Accidents happen. But even as he said it, even as the manager rushed over with a concerned expression and a promise that everything would be taken care of, even as other servers appeared with towels and apologies, David was gathering the documents, trying to salvage what he could. The executive summary was ruined, the text bleeding into illegibility. The financial statements were speckled with red drops that obscured key numbers. The corporate structure diagram looked like a crime scene photo. He blotted frantically with the napkins Maria had provided, trying to save what was still readable. Most of the information existed in digital form on his laptop, but some of his handwritten notes, his observations and questions, those were unique, irreplaceable. And then he saw it. On one of the pages, a printout of Meridian's offshore subsidiary structure. The wine had done something unexpected. The paper was cheap, probably from an office printer that was past its prime. When the liquid hit it, the fibers began to separate, creating a translucent effect where the wine soaked through. And underneath the printed text, barely visible but unmistakable, were words written in pencil, light pencil, the kind that would be invisible under normal circumstances but that showed through when the paper became wet. David's hands froze mid-blot. "They know. Leave now." The words were small, cramped, written in the margin of the document in handwriting that definitely wasn't his. His breath caught in his throat. He looked up sharply, searching for Maria, but she was already moving away from the table, walking quickly toward the kitchen with her back to him. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry about this incident." The manager had appeared at his elbow, a man in his 50s with carefully styled gray hair and a concerned expression that was probably genuine. "Please let us comp your meal, and if there's anything damaged that needs replacing." "It's fine," David said automatically, his mind racing. He was still holding the document, the hidden message now clearly visible through the wine-soaked paper. "Really, it's fine. These things happen." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Someone had written a message on his document, a document that had been in his possession for weeks, that he'd reviewed dozens of times, which meant the message hadn't been there before. It couldn't have been, unless Maria had somehow added it. But how? She'd never touched his papers, had never been close enough to write anything. He'd been watching them the entire time, paranoid about keeping his work secure, unless she'd done it just now in the chaos of the spill. In those few seconds of confusion when he was grabbing his laptop and she was reaching for napkins, she could have. No, that was impossible. You can't write a legible message in pencil in 2 seconds, especially not on paper that's already wet. Which meant the message had been there already, waiting to be revealed. David's mind spun through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He looked down at the document again, studying the handwriting. Small, precise, feminine. The kind of writing someone did when they were trying to communicate something important in a very limited space. They know. Who were they? And what did they know? Leave now. Immediate. Urgent. A warning. He glanced toward the kitchen where Maria had disappeared. The swinging door was still moving slightly from her passage. Through the small window in the door, he could see her inside talking to another server, her hands moving in animated gestures. The manager was still talking, something about restaurant policy and customer satisfaction, but David wasn't listening. He was carefully folding the wine-stained document, tucking it into his messenger bag along with the others. His hands were steady, but his pulse was hammering. "Thank you," he said, cutting off the manager mid-sentence. "I appreciate that, really, but I should probably get going. Early morning tomorrow." "Of course, sir. Again, our sincerest apologies. Your meal is complimentary, naturally." David nodded, already standing, already gathering his things. Laptop into the bag, phone into his pocket, coat from the back of the chair. Every movement mechanical, automatic, while his mind processed the implications of what he'd just discovered. Someone had tried to warn him. Someone who knew what he was working on, who knew he was in danger, who had gone to extraordinary lengths to communicate without being detected. Maria. It had to be Maria. The way she'd been watching his documents all evening. The way she'd positioned herself near his table. The accident that had revealed the hidden message. But why? How did a waitress at an upscale Italian restaurant know anything about corporate acquisitions, or offshore accounts, or whatever danger the message was warning him about? David moved toward the exit, trying not to rush, trying to look like a man who was simply leaving after an unfortunate but forgivable accident. But his eyes kept scanning the restaurant, looking for threats he couldn't name. The businessmen by the window, were they really discussing real estate, or was that a cover? The couple celebrating their anniversary, were they watching him a little too carefully? He was being paranoid. He had to be. This was Chicago on a Monday night. He was a financial analyst, not a spy. The message probably had a simple explanation. Maybe it was from a previous document, something left over from a different project. Maybe it was a prank by a colleague. Maybe. But he couldn't convince himself. The message was too specific, too urgent. And the timing, the method of revelation, it all felt deliberate, planned. David reached the door, his hand on the brass handle, when he heard a voice behind him. "Sir, wait." He turned. Maria was hurrying toward him from the kitchen, still wearing her server's apron, her face flushed. The manager looked annoyed at her breach of protocol. Servers weren't supposed to chase after customers, but she ignored him. "Your napkin," she said, slightly breathless. She held out a white cloth napkin folded into a small square. "You left it on your chair." David stared at her. He hadn't left any napkin. His napkin was still on the table, wine-stained and crumpled. He started to say. "Please," Maria said, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his stomach drop. "Take it." He reached out slowly, accepting the napkin. It felt heavier than it should, like something was wrapped inside. "Thank you," he said carefully. "You're welcome." She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Be careful going home. The weather's getting worse." Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving David standing in the doorway with a napkin in his hand and 100 questions racing through his mind. He stepped outside into the rain, which had indeed gotten worse. The wind had picked up, driving the drops sideways, turning umbrellas inside out. The street was nearly empty now, just a few people hurrying toward shelter. David ducked into the doorway of a closed shop 2 buildings down, out of the direct rain. With shaking fingers, he unfolded the napkin. Inside was a small piece of paper, torn from what looked like an order pad. Written in the same cramped handwriting as the message on his document were 3 lines. "Roosevelt Green Line, 11 p.m. tonight. Come alone. I can explain everything." David stood there in the rain, the note in his hand, feeling his entire world shift beneath his feet. An hour ago, he'd been a financial analyst reviewing an acquisition. Now he was apparently in danger from unnamed enemies, receiving secret messages from a waitress he'd never met before, being summoned to a late-night meeting on a subway platform. This was insane. He should call the police. He should go home, lock his doors, ignore all of this as some elaborate prank or misunderstanding. But the fear in Maria's eyes had been real. The urgency in that whispered warning, "Be careful going home," that had been genuine. And somewhere in the back of his mind, David realized that he'd been expecting something like this. Not consciously, maybe, but those offshore accounts, those circuitous money trails, those shell corporations with no real business, he'd known on some level that he was looking at something wrong, something hidden, something dangerous. He just hadn't known how dangerous until now. David pulled out his phone, rainwater already beating on its screen, and checked the time. 8:47 p.m. He had just over 2 hours to decide whether to go to that meeting. 2 hours to decide whether to treat this as real or walk away. A car passed on the street, its headlights cutting through the rain, and for just a moment, David thought it was slowing down, watching him. But then it accelerated past, taillights disappearing into the storm, and he was alone again. He looked back at Marcello's, its warm lights glowing through the rain-streaked windows. Inside, people were eating and laughing, living their normal lives, unaware that in the corner table a man's world had just been upended by spilled wine and hidden messages. Maria was in there somewhere, probably getting reprimanded by the manager for running after a customer, risking her job, maybe risking more than that, to warn a complete stranger. Why? What did she know? And what had David stumbled into that required secret messages and warnings to leave immediately? He folded the napkin carefully, tucking it into his coat pocket along with the wine-stained document. Then he stepped back out into the rain, pulling his collar up against the wind, and started walking. He didn't know yet if he would go to Roosevelt Station at 11 p.m. He didn't know if he would trust this mysterious warning or dismiss it as paranoia, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life had just changed. The question now was whether he had the courage to find out how much and why. The rain fell harder as he walked, Chicago's autumn storm turning the streets into rivers, washing away the ordinary evening, and leaving behind something darker, more uncertain, more dangerous. And somewhere behind him, in the warm confines of Marcello's Italian restaurant, a waitress named Maria watched through the window as the man she'd just warned disappeared into the night, and hoped desperately that she'd done the right thing, that maybe, just maybe, she'd given him enough of a head start to survive what was coming. David's apartment was in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood that somehow managed to feel both urban and residential at the same time. Tree-lined streets gave way to brick townhouses and modern condos, the kind of place where young professionals paid premium rent for the illusion of space in a city that had none to spare. On a normal night, the 20-minute walk from the Loop would have cleared his head, given him time to decompress from work. Tonight was not a normal night. He took the long route home, doubling back twice, cutting through a 24-hour drugstore, and exiting through a different door. Paranoia, probably. But the note in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, and every set of headlights behind him seemed suspicious. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the time he reached his building, a 6-story structure with a limestone facade, and the kind of Art Deco details that justified the astronomical rent. David punched in the entry code with wet fingers and stepped into the lobby, tracking water across the polished tile floor. Mrs. Chen was checking her mailbox as she did every evening at 9 o'clock with the precision of someone whose life ran on a strict schedule. She was 70-something, had lived in the building for 30 years, and knew everyone's business whether they wanted her to or not. Terrible weather, she said, not looking up from sorting through what appeared to be mostly catalogs and credit card offers. Yeah, supposed to clear up tomorrow, though. That's what they always say. She glanced at him over her reading glasses. You look like you've seen a ghost, Mr. Werner. Everything all right? David forced a smile. Long day at work. You know how it is. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Get some rest. You work too hard, you young people, always rushing, never stopping to breathe. Yes, ma'am, good night. His apartment was on the 4th floor, Unit 4C. David climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Old habit from his brief fitness kick 2 years ago. Though tonight it was more about having extra time to think. The stairwell was empty, silent except for the echo of his footsteps and the distant hum of someone's television. Inside his apartment, David locked the door, threw the deadbolt, and stood for a moment in the darkness, just listening. The familiar sounds of home, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the radiator ticking as it warmed up, the muffled conversation from the unit next door where the graduate students were probably arguing about philosophy again. Normal. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. David turned on the lights and immediately went to his desk, a converted dining table positioned near the window that overlooked the street. His laptop came out first, password protected and encrypted because he'd always been careful about security. The wine-stained documents followed, spread across the desk in the order he'd removed them from his bag. The message was still there, still visible through the translucent paper. They know. Leave now. In the harsh overhead light of his apartment, it looked less ominous. Just pencil marks on wet paper. Could be anything. Could be nothing. But David had spent his entire career reading between lines, finding patterns and numbers, seeing what others missed. And this felt like a pattern. He opened his laptop and pulled up the digital copies of the documents Maria had spilled wine on. The Meridian Technologies file, 3 months of research, due diligence, financial analysis. He compared the printed version to the digital one, looking for any discrepancies. There, on the offshore subsidiary chart, the printed version showed one additional entity that didn't appear in the digital file, a holding company registered in Panama called Clearwater Holdings LLC. It was nestled in the corporate structure between the Cayman Islands entity and the Irish subsidiary, easy to miss in the tangle of corporate relationships. David frowned. He would have sworn that entity wasn't there when he printed these documents 2 days ago, but there it was, in black and white, with the pencil message written directly below it. Someone had altered the printed document, added that entity, then written the warning underneath, knowing the wine would make it visible. Maria. It had to be Maria. But how? When? David pulled out the napkin note, studying the handwriting again. Small, precise, feminine, the same handwriting as the warning on the document. Roosevelt Green Line, 11 p.m. tonight. Come alone. I can explain everything. He checked his watch. 9:34 p.m. Just over an hour to decide. The rational part of his brain, the part that had gotten him through business school, through CPA exams, through countless corporate presentations, was screaming at him to ignore all of this. Call the police if he was really worried. Or better yet, just go to bed, assume it was some kind of elaborate prank, and deal with it in the morning when everything would seem less dramatic. But another part of him, quieter but more insistent, knew that something was genuinely wrong. The offshore accounts had bothered him for weeks. The shell corporations, the circuitous money trails, the complexity that went far beyond normal tax optimization. He'd been telling himself it was just corporate structure, just business as usual in the modern global economy. Now someone was telling him it was more than that. Someone was warning him that asking questions about Meridian Technologies had put him in danger. David stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. A car was parked across from his building, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. As he watched, the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out, tall, wearing a dark coat, face obscured by the angle and the rain. The man looked up at David's building. Just looked. Standing there in the rain, hands in his pockets, staring at the entrance. David stepped back from the window, heart suddenly pounding. He was being watched. The warning wasn't paranoia. Someone actually was monitoring him. He grabbed his phone, started to dial 911, then stopped. And tell them what? That a man was standing on a public street? That he'd received a cryptic warning from a waitress? That he had a feeling something was wrong? They'd think he was crazy, or paranoid, or both. David moved away from the window, keeping to the shadows, and peered down again. The man was still there, now talking on a phone. Just a brief conversation. Then he got back in the car. But he didn't drive away. The car just sat there, engine idling, waiting. Decision made. David grabbed his messenger bag and started packing. The laptop went in first, then the stained documents, then a legal pad and 3 pens. He changed into darker clothes, jeans, a black sweater, his most comfortable walking shoes, his winter coat, the one without any reflective strips, a baseball cap he'd gotten at a Cubs game 3 years ago. He was dressing for surveillance evasion, he realized. Like some character in a thriller novel. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. Except nothing about this felt funny. At 10:15 p.m., David left his apartment through the back entrance, the one that opened onto the alley behind the building. It was rarely used except by residents taking out trash, and at this hour it was deserted. The rain had picked up again, providing cover as he walked quickly down the alley, emerged onto a side street 3 blocks from his building, and hailed a cab. "Where to?" the driver asked, a middle-aged woman with a slight Eastern European accent. "Just drive for now. I'll tell you in a minute." She gave him a look in the rearview mirror but pulled into traffic without comment. David watched through the back window, looking for any sign of the dark car following them. Nothing. Just the normal flow of Chicago nighttime traffic, headlights and brake lights reflecting off wet pavement. After 5 minutes of random turns, David was reasonably confident they weren't being followed. "Roosevelt Road and State Street," he said. "The Green Line station." The driver nodded and adjusted her route. David settled back in his seat, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He was doing this. Actually doing this. Meeting a mysterious waitress at a subway station at 11 p.m. based on a note hidden in a napkin. If this turned out to be nothing, if Maria was just some conspiracy theorist, or if this was all an elaborate prank, he was going to feel like an idiot. But if it was real, if the danger was genuine, then he needed to know, needed to understand what he'd stumbled into. The cab dropped him off 2 blocks from Roosevelt Station at 10:47 p.m. David paid in cash, adding a generous tip, and the driver gave him what might have been a concerned look before pulling away. The station entrance loomed ahead, a utilitarian concrete structure that led down to the elevated platform. At this hour, on a rainy Monday night, foot traffic was sparse. A few late-shift workers heading home. A couple of college students loud and laughing. An elderly man pushing a shopping cart full of possessions. David descended the stairs, paid his fare at the automated kiosk, and made his way to the platform. The Green Line ran above ground here, the tracks elevated on massive concrete pillars that had been part of Chicago's infrastructure for over a century. The platform was open to the elements, protected only by a rusted metal canopy that did little to block the wind and rain. He positioned himself near the center of the platform, where he could see both approaches and the stairs leading up and down. A digital sign indicated the next train would arrive in 8 minutes. David checked his watch. 10:53 p.m. 7 minutes until the meeting time. The platform was nearly empty. An older woman sat on a bench, her shopping bags clustered around her feet. 2 teenage boys were skateboarding at the far end, their wheels echoing on the concrete despite the no skateboarding signs. A businessman in an expensive suit paced while talking on his phone, apparently unconcerned about the rain soaking through his coat. David watched them all, trying to determine if any of them seemed suspicious. Seemed like they were watching him. The woman was absorbed in her phone. The teenagers were in their own world. The businessman was clearly stressed about whatever deal he was discussing. Normal. All of it looked normal. At 10:58 p.m., David saw her. Maria emerged from the stairwell at the south end of the platform, no longer wearing her server uniform. She'd changed into jeans and a dark jacket, her hair now down around her shoulders instead of pulled back. She walked quickly, head down, hands shoved in her pockets. But every few steps, she looked around, scanning, checking. The movements of someone who knew she might be followed. She spotted David and her pace increased slightly, but she didn't approach him directly. Instead, she walked past him to a vending machine, fed it a few dollars, and purchased a bottle of water she clearly didn't want. Only then did she turn and move closer, positioning herself beside him as if they were both just waiting for the train. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her eyes still scanning the platform. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," David admitted. "What's this about? The message on my documents?" "Not here, not yet." She nodded toward the digital sign. "There's a train in 4 minutes. We get on, we ride it a few stops, make sure no one's following. Then we talk." "Who would be following us?" Maria's expression was grim. "The same people who followed my brother. The same people who've been watching you since Friday." David felt his stomach drop. "How do you know about the train?" she interrupted. "We talk on the train." In the distance, David could hear the approaching rumble of the green line, its headlight visible as it curved around a bend in the track. The handful of people on the platform began gathering their belongings, moving toward where the doors would open. Maria stayed close to David, but not too close, maintaining the appearance that they were strangers who just happened to be traveling in the same direction. The train pulled in with a screech of brakes, its doors hissing open. They boarded the same car but sat separately, Maria near the back, David in the middle. Through the window's reflection, he could watch her as she watched the platform, looking for anyone who might board at the last second. The doors closed. The train lurched forward, and as Roosevelt Station fell away behind them, David realized he'd just committed himself to whatever came next. No turning back now. The car was nearly empty. An exhausted-looking nurse in scrubs sat near the front, her eyes closed. A young man with headphones was absorbed in his phone. No one paid any attention to David or Maria. After 2 stops, as the train pulled away from the Indiana Avenue station, Maria stood and moved to sit across from David. Up close he could see the exhaustion in her face, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. "My name is Maria Santos," she said quietly. "I've been working at Marcello's for 3 months, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of my brother. Your brother. Carlos Santos." She pulled out her phone, showed David a photo. 2 people smiling at the camera, clearly siblings. Same dark eyes, same smile. The photo had been taken at some kind of family gathering, everyone happy and relaxed. He worked as a janitor at a company called Meridian Technologies. David's blood went cold. Meridian. Maria nodded. He was a good kid, hardworking, put himself through community college while working nights to clean offices. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble found him anyway. She paused as the train slowed for the next station. 1 person got off. No one got on. The doors closed again and they continued into the night. About 4 months ago, Carlos started noticing things at work. Documents left on desks after everyone had gone home. Emails pulled up on computer screens that people forgot to log out of. Financial records in the trash. He didn't think much of it at first. He was there to empty garbage cans and vacuum floors, not to read corporate paperwork. But he did read them, David said. Eventually. One night he found a whole stack of documents in a recycling bin. Bank statements, corporate filings, transaction records. All of it should have been shredded, but someone had gotten lazy. Carlos almost just threw it all away, but something caught his eye. The numbers were huge, millions of dollars, and the accounts were all offshore. Panama, Cayman Islands, places like that. David thought of his own research, the offshore structures that had bothered him so much. That's not necessarily illegal. That's what Carlos thought too. But then he started paying attention, started noticing patterns. Late-night meetings with people who didn't work there. Conversations about cleaning money and restructuring assets. Documents with one set of numbers for the IRS and different numbers for internal reports. Maria's hands were shaking slightly as she spoke. David noticed she kept glancing toward the doors at each stop, watching for threats. Carlos photographed everything he could, took pictures with his phone, saved them to the cloud. He wasn't sure what to do with the information, but he knew it was important. Knew something wrong was happening. Did he go to the police? Better. He went to the FBI, scheduled a meeting with an agent who specialized in financial crimes. That was 3 weeks ago. Maria's voice cracked slightly. He never made it to that meeting. The train pulled into another station. This time several people boarded and Maria fell silent until they'd settled into their seats and the train was moving again. What happened? David asked, though part of him already knew, already dreaded the answer. They say he jumped from his apartment balcony 4 floors up. The police investigation took less than a day. They found a note, supposedly a suicide note, saying he was depressed, couldn't handle the stress of work and school. Maria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But Carlos wasn't depressed. He was excited about the future. He'd just gotten accepted to a better college. He'd met a girl he liked. He was happy. The note could have been forged. Yes, I know that. But try convincing the police they see what they want to see. Young immigrant working multiple jobs, academic pressure. It fits their narrative so they don't look deeper. David felt a chill run through him. You think Meridian found out what he knew? I know they did. 2 days before he died, Carlos called me. Said he thought someone was following him. Said weird things were happening. His apartment door unlocked when he was sure he'd locked it. His phone acting strange. A car that kept appearing wherever he went. I told him he was being paranoid. That he should just forget about the documents and focus on school. Her voice broke. I told him to let it go. The train emerged from underground onto an elevated section of track. And suddenly, they were high above the city. Chicago spreading out beneath them in a grid of lights and shadows. Rain streaked the windows, distorting the view. I'm sorry, David said, and meant it. But I still don't understand what this has to do with me. Maria looked at him directly for the first time since they'd sat down together. Carlos kept a notebook, handwritten old school because he didn't trust digital records after a while. In that notebook, he listed everyone he thought was involved in whatever Meridian was doing. Company executives, board members, their lawyers, and outside people too. People from other companies who seemed connected to the same offshore accounts. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small spiral notebook, worn and water-stained. David recognized it from the photo she'd shown him. It was tucked under Carlos's arm in that family gathering picture. One of the names he wrote down was Richard Caldwell, your boss, the managing director at your firm. Maria flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. See? Right here. Caldwell's name connected to something Carlos called the Acquisition Network, a group of companies that appeared to be separate but were actually all controlled by the same people, moving money between them in ways that hid where it really came from and where it was really going. David stared at the page. His boss's name, written in a dead man's handwriting, connected by lines and arrows to offshore accounts and shell corporations. When I saw you at the restaurant, Maria continued, I recognized your face from your LinkedIn profile. I'd been researching everyone in Carlos's notebook, trying to figure out who I could trust, who might be able to help. You weren't on the list of people Carlos suspected. You were clean, but you work for Caldwell, which meant you were either involved or you were in danger. So you spilled wine on my documents. I added a page to your documents when you went to the bathroom earlier in the evening, slipped it into your stack while I was refilling your water glass. The page with the warning written in pencil. I knew the wine would make it visible. I had to warn you somehow without being obvious, without letting anyone watching know that I was making contact. David remembered now. He had gone to the bathroom about halfway through his meal. His documents had been sitting on the table, visible to anyone passing by. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. You've been planning this for weeks, ever since Carlos died. I got the job at Marcello's specifically because I knew people from your firm ate there sometimes. I've been waiting, watching, hoping to make contact with someone who might be able to help expose what happened to my brother. The train was slowing for another stop. Maria glanced at the doors, then back at David. You're reviewing the acquisition of Meridian Technologies. Carlos's notebook mentions that acquisition, says it's not really an acquisition at all, but a takeover. A way for the people behind the money laundering to gain control of Meridian's operations more completely. That doesn't make sense, David said. If they already control Meridian, why would they need to acquire it through another company? Because Meridian is under investigation. Not publicly, not obviously, but Carlos found documents indicating the SEC had opened a preliminary inquiry. The acquisition lets them restructure, hide evidence, move assets around before investigators can freeze anything. David's mind was racing, connecting dots he'd been circling around for weeks. The overly complex corporate structure, the offshore accounts that didn't match normal business operations, the rush to complete the acquisition by the end of the quarter, Caldwell's dismissiveness whenever David raised questions. It all fit. Horrifyingly, it all fit. What do you want from me? He asked. I want justice for Carlos. I want the people responsible exposed and prosecuted. And I want to make sure what happened to him doesn't happen to you. Maria leaned forward, her voice urgent. You're asking the right questions about Meridian. I can see it in the documents you were reviewing. You flagged the same irregularities Carlos found, which means they know you're getting close to the truth. The man watching my building tonight. Probably surveillance, yes. They need to know if you're going to be a problem. If you are, they'll deal with you the way they dealt with Carlos. The train pulled into the Ashland 63rd station. The doors opened and several people got off. Through the window, David could see the platform, nearly empty at this hour, just a couple of people waiting to board. And then he saw something that made his heart stop. A man in a dark coat standing just beyond the platform lights. Not waiting for the train, just standing, watching. The same man who'd been outside David's apartment building. Maria, he said quietly, we need to go. Now. She followed his gaze and saw the man, too. Her face went pale. The next stop. We get off at the next stop and we run. But as the train doors closed and they started moving again, David saw the man pull out a phone, saw him make a brief call, coordinating, planning. They weren't just being watched anymore. They were being hunted. And the next station was still 2 minutes away. The train rattled through the night, every second feeling like an eternity. David kept his eyes fixed on the window, watching the city blur past while his mind calculated escape routes, possibilities, worst-case scenarios. Beside him, Maria sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. We can't panic, she whispered. If we panic, we make mistakes. Easy for you to say, David replied, though he appreciated her attempt at calm. You've been dealing with this for weeks. I found out an hour ago that my life might be in danger. Then trust me, I've thought about this. A lot. Maria's eyes flicked to the other passengers in the car. The nurse still dozing near the front, the young man with headphones, an older couple who'd boarded 2 stops back. When we get off, we stay with crowds. We don't go anywhere isolated. We find somewhere public, somewhere with security cameras and witnesses. The train began to slow. The digital sign above the doors read, Halstead. David's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached the platform. Ready? Maria asked. David nodded, not trusting his voice. The train screeched to a halt. The doors opened with their familiar hydraulic hiss. David and Maria stood simultaneously, moving toward the exit with the careful nonchalance of people who weren't running for their lives. They stepped onto the platform. Cold wind hit David's face, carrying the smell of rain and diesel. The platform was better lit than the previous station, and there were more people, a group of young professionals who'd clearly been out drinking, a security guard making his rounds, a street vendor packing up his cart for the night. This way, Maria said, heading toward the stairs that led down to street level. They were halfway there when David saw him. The man in the dark coat was climbing the opposite stairway, moving against the flow of departing passengers. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and David saw recognition flash across the man's face. He's here, David said urgently. Maria grabbed his arm. Don't run. Walk fast, but don't run. Running draws attention. They descended the stairs quickly, David's messenger bag bouncing against his hip. Behind them, he could hear the man's footsteps, faster now, no longer pretending casualness. At street level, Halstead Street stretched in both directions, lined with restaurants and bars still open despite the late hour and bad weather. Music spilled from doorways. People clustered under awnings, smoking and talking. Normal Tuesday night life in Chicago. oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. There, Maria pointed to a 24-hour diner across the street, its windows bright with fluorescent light. Lots of people, security cameras. He won't try anything obvious. They crossed quickly, dodging a taxi that honked irritably. Through the diner's window, David could see it was crowded. Late-night diners, insomniacs nursing coffee, shift workers grabbing food between jobs. Perfect. They pushed through the door, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon enveloped them. A harried waitress barely glanced up as they found a booth in the back, positioned so they could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. David risked a look through the window. The man in the dark coat was standing across the street, phone to his ear again, making another call, getting instructions or calling for backup. He's not coming in, David observed. Not yet, but he knows where we are now. We've got maybe 10-15 minutes before others arrive. Maria flagged down the waitress. Coffee, 2 cups, and keep them coming. The waitress nodded and disappeared. Maria pulled out her phone, then hesitated. They might be tracking our phones. Carlos said his was compromised the last few days. How would they do that? David asked, though he'd read enough about corporate espionage to know it was possible. Spyware, probably. Something installed remotely. If they've been watching you for days, they've had time to do it. Maria pulled the battery from her phone, an older model that still allowed such things. You should do the same. David's phone was newer, sealed. I can't remove the battery. Then turn it off completely. Power down, not just sleep mode. He complied, watching the screen go dark. Without his phone, he felt oddly vulnerable, cut off from the world. No way to call for help. No GPS. No emergency contact capability. The coffee arrived, and Maria wrapped her hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from it. We need a plan. We can't just sit here hoping they give up. What about going to the police? You have Carlos's notebook. I have the documents showing the offshore accounts. That's got to be enough to start an investigation. Maria shook her head. Carlos tried that route, remember? The police didn't listen then, and they won't listen now. We need more than a notebook and some suspicious financial records. We need proof of actual crimes. We need someone who can't be ignored or intimidated. Like who? Like a journalist. Someone with credibility and reach. Someone who's covered corporate fraud before and knows how to protect sources. David thought about it. He'd read investigative pieces in the Chicago Tribune, exposés in national publications. Do you know any journalists? No, but I bet we can find one. Maria glanced around the diner, then gestured to a young guy sitting alone at the counter, laptop open. Excuse me. Sorry to bother you, but do you have internet access we could use for a minute? Our phones died. The guy looked up, taking in their disheveled appearance, the desperation probably visible in their eyes. Sure, I guess. What do you need? Just to look up a name, 1 search, 2 minutes tops. He hesitated, then turned his laptop toward them. Make it quick. I'm working on a deadline. Maria typed quickly. Chicago investigative journalist corporate fraud. Several results appeared. She scanned them, clicking through to a few articles. Here, Jennifer Huang, senior investigative reporter at the Tribune. She broke that story about the pension fund fraud last year. Won some kind of journalism award for it. David read over her shoulder. The articles were thorough, well-researched, exactly the kind of journalism that took down powerful people. How do we contact her? It's almost midnight. Most investigative reporters have tip lines, public email addresses for sources. Maria clicked through to the Tribune's website, found Jennifer Huang's contact page. There, tipsitribunemail.com, and a phone number, but we can't use that without phones. We could send an email from his laptop, David suggested. Too risky. They might be monitoring our online activity too. The moment we log into an email account, they could trace it. Maria thanked the laptop owner and returned to their booth, thinking hard. We need to make contact in person. Tomorrow morning. The Tribune offices are downtown, not far from here. That gives them all night to find us, David pointed out. Then we don't stay in one place. We move around, stay in public spaces, wait for morning. Maria checked her watch. 6 hours. We can stay ahead of them for 6 hours. David wanted to argue, to suggest something safer, smarter, but he couldn't think of anything. They were trapped in a situation that felt increasingly surreal, hiding from corporate assassins in a Chicago diner, planning to approach a journalist with a story that sounded like a conspiracy theory. There's something you should know, he said quietly. About the acquisition. I've been reviewing the financials for weeks, and there are irregularities beyond just the offshore accounts. Maria leaned forward. What kind of irregularities? Meridian reported revenues of about 80 million last year, but when you trace the actual cash flows, a significant portion doesn't come from their stated business operations. It comes from these consulting fees and licensing agreements with shell companies. Companies that don't seem to have any real employees or operations. Money laundering, Maria said. Taking dirty money, running it through fake business transactions, making it look legitimate. That's what I suspected, but I couldn't prove it. And every time I brought up concerns, Caldwell shut me down. Told me I was overthinking things, being too cautious. David pulled out the wine-stained documents from his bag. Look at this corporate structure. It's deliberately complex, designed to obscure who actually controls what. There are at least 7 layers of holding companies between Meridian and the ultimate beneficial owners. Maria studied the diagram. Carlos found something similar. He called it the network. Said it wasn't just Meridian, there were 4 or 5 other companies all connected through the same offshore structures. Moving money between them, creating paper trails that looked legitimate but were actually just shuffling the same funds around. And my firm wants to acquire Meridian, which means we'd be taking on all of this, becoming part of the network, whether we know it or not. That's the beauty of it, Maria said bitterly. Your firm is legitimate, has a good reputation. Once you acquire Meridian, all of this becomes harder to investigate. It gets buried in a larger corporate structure, protected by armies of lawyers and accountants who can claim ignorance. David felt sick. He'd spent 3 months working on this acquisition, proud of his thorough analysis, his attention to detail, and all that time he'd been helping to facilitate exactly the kind of corporate crime he'd been trained to prevent. Caldwell knows, he said. Has to. You don't structure something this complex by accident. The question is who else knows. How deep does this go in your firm? Before David could answer, movement outside caught his eye. Another car had pulled up across the street. 2 men got out, both wearing dark coats, both scanning the area with the systematic precision of people conducting surveillance. We've got company, David said quietly. Maria followed his gaze. Back exit, now. They stood, leaving money on the table for the coffee. The waitress called after them. Hey, did you want to order food? But they were already moving, weaving between tables toward the back of the diner. The emergency exit was next to the restrooms, marked with the standard red sign. David pushed the door open, setting off a shrill alarm that made everyone in the diner turn to look. They stumbled into an alley, darker than the street, lined with dumpsters and loading docks. The alarm continued its piercing wail behind them, which was both good and bad. It would draw attention, possibly police, but it also announced exactly where they'd gone. Which way? David asked. Maria pointed left, toward the main street. More people, more options. They ran, their footsteps echoing off brick walls. Behind them, David could hear shouts, the sound of the diner's back door being thrown open. The men were following, no longer pretending this was anything other than a chase. The alley ended at a busier street, North Halstead, still busy with nightlife despite the late hour. Bars and clubs lined both sides, their neon signs reflected in puddles left by the earlier rain. People clustered outside, smoking and talking, blessed unaware of the desperation of the 2 people who burst from the alley. David and Maria slowed to a fast walk, trying to blend in, but David could feel eyes on them, could sense the hunters closing in. In here, Maria said, pulling him toward a crowded bar called the Violet Hour. Music thumped from inside and a line of people waited to get past the bouncer. They joined the line, trying to look casual. David's heart was racing so fast he thought it might burst. The bouncer, a massive man with a shaved head and arms like tree trunks, looked them over skeptically. ID? David fumbled for his wallet, pulled out his driver's license with shaking hands. Maria did the same. The bouncer studied them for a long moment, then stepped aside. Covers 20 each. David paid quickly, and they escaped into the crowded interior. The bar was packed, bodies pressed together, the air thick with perfume and sweat and spilled alcohol. Music pounded from speakers, bass so loud David could feel it in his chest. Perfect, Maria shouted over the noise. Too crowded for them to try anything, too public. They pushed toward the back, finding a corner where they could watch the entrance. Sure enough, within minutes, one of the men in dark coats appeared in the doorway, scanning the crowd. He sees us, David said. Doesn't matter. He can't do anything here. Too many witnesses, too many cameras. Maria pulled him deeper into the crowd. We wait 20 minutes. Then we leave through a different exit. Keep them guessing. They stood pressed into the corner, surrounded by people dancing and drinking and living their normal lives. David felt absurdly out of place, still wearing his work clothes, his messenger bag clutched to his chest like a life preserver. Maria looked more at ease, or at least better at pretending. "How did you become so good at this?" David asked, leaning close so she could hear him over the music. "I wasn't. Not at first. After Carlos died, I was a mess. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. But then I got angry. Started researching, started planning. You learn quickly when your survival depends on it. I'm sorry about your brother. Save your sympathy. Help me get justice for him. That's what matters now." A commotion at the entrance made them both tense. The man in the dark coat was arguing with the bouncer, gesturing toward the interior. The bouncer stood his ground, arms crossed, immovable. After a moment, the man gave up and left. "He'll be waiting outside," Maria predicted, "probably radioing for others to cover all the exits. So we're trapped. We're safe for now. That's what matters." Maria checked her watch again. "It's 12:47. We need to last until morning. 6 more hours. 6 hours. David thought about his apartment, his comfortable bed, his normal life that seemed impossibly far away now. 24 hours ago, he'd been worried about a presentation. Now he was running from people who'd already killed once to protect their secrets. "Tell me more about the network," he said, needing to focus on something concrete. "You said there were other companies besides Meridian?" Maria nodded. "According to Carlos's notes, at least 4 others. All mid-sized companies, all in different industries. A logistics firm, a medical supply company, a construction business, and Meridian. On the surface, they have nothing in common. But underneath, they're all connected through the same offshore structures. Different industries would be smart," David mused. "Harder to spot the pattern. Each company could claim legitimate business reasons for its financial structure." "Exactly. And the amounts are just small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. A few million here, a few million there. Over time it adds up to hundreds of millions, but no single transaction is large enough to draw immediate attention." David thought about the consulting fees he'd flagged in his report. $12 million over 6 months. Significant, but not outrageous for a tech company. Easy to justify, easy to explain away. "The acquisition happens next week," he said. "If we don't stop it, my firm becomes complicit. We take on Meridian's liabilities, legal and otherwise. Can you stop it? Call your board? Tell them what you know? With what evidence? Your brother's notebook and my suspicions? They'd dismiss it. Worse, they'd alert Caldwell, and then we'd have no chance at all. Then we go public. We contact Jennifer Huang, give her everything we have, let her investigate properly. That takes time. Weeks, maybe months to verify everything, to build a case strong enough to publish. So we buy time. You stall the acquisition. Raise concerns? Ask for additional due diligence? Find some technical reason to delay." David considered it. "I could claim I found accounting irregularities that need investigation. Request an independent audit. That would push things back at least a month. Would Caldwell agree to that? He'd fight it, but he'd have to be careful. If he pushes too hard to ignore legitimate accounting concerns, it looks suspicious. Creates a paper trail of him dismissing valid objections." Maria smiled grimly. "There you go. We have a plan. You delay the acquisition, I contact the journalist, we build a case, we expose everything, and we hope they don't kill us first. There's that too." The music shifted to something slower, and the crowd around them thinned slightly as people moved toward the bar for refills. David could see the entrance more clearly now. No sign of the dark-coated men, but he didn't trust that they were gone. His phone was still powered off in his pocket. A dead weight. He wondered if anyone had tried to call him. His boss, concerned about tomorrow's meetings. His sister in Seattle, their weekly check-in. The dry cleaner, reminding him to pick up his suits. Normal life, continuing without him while he hid in a bar, planning how to expose a corporate conspiracy. "What happens after?" he asked. "If we succeed, if this all works out, what happens to us?" Maria looked at him, and for the first time he saw vulnerability in her expression. "I don't know. I haven't let myself think that far ahead. Getting through today, getting through tonight, that's all I can handle. You can't go back to the restaurant." "No, and you can't go back to your firm even if you wanted to." They stood in silence for a moment, two people whose lives had been upended by forces beyond their control. David thought about his career, 12 years of building expertise and reputation, all about to be destroyed. Even if they succeeded, even if they exposed the truth, he'd be marked. The analyst who blew the whistle, who cost his firm a major deal, who couldn't be trusted to keep quiet. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was being Carlos. Eliminated, disappeared. His death written off as suicide while the guilty walked free. We should move, Maria said, checking her watch again. It's been long enough. Time to find somewhere else. They worked their way through the crowd toward a side exit Maria had spotted earlier. The bouncer at this door was younger, less attentive. They slipped past him into another alley, this one cleaner than the last, better lit. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cold and clear. Stars were visible between the buildings, rare for Chicago with its light pollution. David looked up at them, thinking about how small their problems were in the cosmic scheme of things, then immediately feeling foolish for the thought. Their problems might be cosmically insignificant, but they could still get them killed. They emerged onto a different street, heading east toward Lake Michigan. The neighborhood was quieter here, more residential. Fewer places to hide, but also fewer places for hunters to lurk unseen. There's a 24-hour coffee shop near DePaul, Maria said. Students study there all night. We could blend in, wait until morning. How far? 20-minute walk. 30 if we're being careful. They started walking, staying in well-lit areas, avoiding empty streets. Twice they saw cars that might have been surveillance, and both times they ducked into convenience stores or doorways until the vehicles passed. The coffee shop, when they finally reached it, was exactly what Maria had described. Brightly lit, filled with college students hunched over laptops and textbooks, the air thick with the smell of espresso and desperation that came with late-night studying. They ordered coffee they didn't want and found a table near the back, surrounded by students too absorbed in their own work to pay attention to two exhausted-looking people who'd just run across half the city. 4 more hours, Maria said quietly. Then we find Jennifer Huang. Then we start fighting back. David nodded, too tired to speak. His adrenaline was fading, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion. He wanted to sleep, to close his eyes and wake up, to find this was all a nightmare. But Maria was watching the door with eyes that never stopped moving, and David knew sleep wasn't an option. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. They were in it now, all the way. No turning back. The only question was whether they'd survive long enough to tell the story. Dawn broke over Chicago with the kind of pale, tentative light that promised nothing. David and Maria sat in the coffee shop, surrounded by the debris of a sleepless night. Empty cups, crumpled napkins, the nervous energy of two people who'd survived until morning against the odds. It's time, Maria said, checking the clock on the wall. 6:47 a.m. The Tribune offices open at 7. They gathered their things and stepped out into the cold morning air. The city was waking up, early commuters hurrying toward the train, delivery trucks unloading at restaurants, the urban machinery grinding into motion for another day. To everyone around them, it was just Tuesday morning, normal, ordinary. David and Maria knew better. The Tribune Tower loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture stark against the brightening sky. They climbed the steps, pushed through the revolving doors into a lobby that smelled of coffee and printer ink. We need to see Jennifer Huang, Maria told the security guard at the desk. It's urgent, about a story she's been investigating. The guard looked skeptical. Do you have an appointment? No, but then you'll need to email her or call during business hours. David stepped forward, lowering his voice. We have information about corporate fraud, financial crimes involving hundreds of millions of dollars. People have died to keep this quiet. If we leave without seeing her, we might not get another chance. Something in his tone must have convinced the guard. He picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then nodded. 4th floor. Someone will meet you at the elevator. The someone turned out to be Jennifer Huang herself, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of alertness that suggested she'd already consumed several cups of coffee. She looked them over, taking in their disheveled appearance, the exhaustion written on their faces. My office, she said simply. They followed her through a maze of cubicles to a small office overlooking Michigan Avenue. Jennifer closed the door, pulled the blinds, and gestured for them to sit. You have 60 seconds to convince me this isn't a waste of my time. Maria pulled out Carlos's notebook. David spread his wine-stained documents across the desk. And they talked. They talked about Meridian Technologies and offshore accounts, about shell corporations and laundered money, about a janitor who'd discovered too much and a financial analyst who'd asked too many questions, about surveillance and threats, and a brother who'd supposedly jumped from his balcony but who'd been pushed. Jennifer listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she sat back in her chair. This is huge. If it's real, It's real, Maria said fiercely. My brother is dead because it's real. I believe you, but belief isn't proof. I need to verify everything before I can publish. Jennifer turned to her computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, I can trace those. It'll take time, but I can do it. What I need from you is testimony. Someone willing to go on record. David and Maria exchanged glances. We'll testify, David said. Both of us. That puts targets on your backs. Bigger targets than you already have. They're already trying to kill us, Maria pointed out. How much worse can it get? Jennifer made several phone calls. To contacts at the FBI, to a lawyer she trusted, to her editor. The morning dissolved into a flurry of activity. Federal agents arrived, asked questions, took statements. The lawyer explained witness protection, the legal process, what would happen next. By noon, David and Maria were in protective custody, tucked away in a safe house while investigators began pulling threads on the network Carlos had discovered. By evening, Jennifer's story had broken. Front page of the Tribune's website, trending on social media, picked up by national news outlets. The acquisition of Meridian Technologies was suspended pending investigation. Arrests were expected within days. David sat in the safe house watching the news coverage on a television someone had provided. His phone, a new one, secure, monitored, buzzed with messages from his sister, from former colleagues, from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Maria sat beside him, Carlos's notebook open in her lap. She was crying quietly, and David understood. This was victory and grief tangled together. Justice that came too late to save the person who'd mattered most. He'd be proud of you, David said. He'd be alive if I'd listened to him sooner. You couldn't have known. I should have. They sat in silence as the television continued its coverage. Caldwell's face appeared on screen, led out of the office in handcuffs, his expression shocked and outraged. More arrests were coming. The investigation was expanding. The network was unraveling. 3 weeks later, David stood in a cemetery on the south side of Chicago, Maria beside him. Carlos's grave was simple, just a headstone with his name and dates, no elaborate epitaph. Maria placed flowers at its base, her movements careful and deliberate. We did it, she whispered. It's not over yet, but we did it. David thought about the grand jury testimony he'd given, the depositions still to come. His career was finished, at least in its current form, but he'd found something else. Purpose, perhaps. A reason to use his skills for something that mattered. What will you do now? He asked Maria. Testify. Fight. Make sure everyone involved pays for what they did. She looked up at him. You? The same. And maybe, he hesitated, maybe help other people who find themselves in situations like ours. Whistleblowers. People who need someone to believe them. Maria smiled, and it transformed her face. Carlos would have liked that. They stood together in the cold December wind, two people forever changed by wine spilled on documents and a warning that had saved their lives. The city continued around them, indifferent and eternal, but they had changed it. Just a little, had exposed truth and demanded justice. And in the end, that was enough. The cemetery gate closed behind them as they walked toward an uncertain future, knowing only that they'd survived, they'd fought back, and they'd won. The truth had indeed come with a price. But some truths were worth paying for.